This is your 2-minute warning for getting started again. We don't want to get going late after a good start. If the presenters could come up, Ashley, Noah, and Geoff. Just one quick announcement, too, that thank you to Liz Monk for organizing the T-shirt exchange. If we could give her a round of applause for all of her organizing. So there are sheets here if you've participated, and so you give to a different person and you receive from a different person. So there's two links to maximize networking. So you should exchange shirts before we will take a photo Friday morning sometime, usually right after the first session. So exchange shirts before then for the photo, and we're all ready to get started, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael Rich.
Thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everyone. We're going to kick our panel off on residential instability perspectives from 3 cities. Folks in the room and those that preceded you in the NNIP network over the years have engaged a broad group of local stakeholders in a wide variety of topics in their communities. The issue of neighborhood change and residential stability and instability likely ranks near the top of the list in terms of the kinds of projects that local NNIP partners have been involved with. As Anthony Downs noted years ago in his book, Neighborhoods and Urban Development, neighborhoods are constantly changing. We only tend to notice it when the characteristics of people and businesses moving in look different from those that are moving out. A new paper just out by urban researchers Brett Theodos and Sarah McTernahan, and NNIP co-founder and future Hall of Famer Claudia Colton, examines the multiple causes and consequences of residential instability, highlighting the complexity of the issues across multiple levels and systems, and noting the difficulty of isolating the effects of factors, multiple factors such as metropolitan area and housing market dynamics, neighborhood dynamics, household characteristics, housing conditions, and the cross-cutting and typically fragmented safety net systems that serve vulnerable populations. Just as the causes are multifaceted and multidimensional, so too are the consequences for families and individuals, neighborhoods, communities, and the institutions that serve them. In this session this morning, we highlight the work of three NNIP participants regarding their data building, capacity building, and advocacy on behalf of low-income communities related to residential instability from the perspective of their communities. I'm going to briefly introduce each speaker, and then we'll go hear their presentations in the order in which they're listed in your program. Our first speaker is Ashley Williams-Clark, who is the Director of Outreach and Strategic Partnerships and the Interim Director of the Institute for Social Capital at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She earned her master's degree in City and Regional Planning from the University of North Carolina and has more than 5 years of experience working on issues related to affordable housing, community development, and neighborhood change. She will share with us findings from a recent ISC report on housing instability and homelessness, emphasizing emphasizing an extensive analysis that was conducted on evictions in the city of Charlotte. Noah Urban has been with the NNIP Detroit partner, Data Driven Detroit, for the past 5 years, where he currently serves as a senior analyst and the lead for the Motor City Mapping Project. Noah has a master's degree in urban planning from Wayne State University, and his presentation will inform us how Data Driven Detroit is identifying rental properties to track housing stability in Detroit. Data Driven Detroit is also one of 3 NNIP partners currently participating in a cross-site project, Turning the Corner, Monitoring Neighborhood Change for Action, which runs through the end of this year. NNIP partners in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Milwaukee are also participating in this project. And then our cleanup hitter, Geoff Smith, our third presenter this morning, is the Executive Director of the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul University, whose mission is to provide reliable, impartial, and timely data and research to inform housing and community development policy decisions and discussions in the Chicago region and nationally. Prior to joining IHS, Geoff was a senior vice president of the Woodstock Institute, where he led a number of studies examining the economic health of neighborhood housing markets and factors that threaten the viability of economically vulnerable communities. He earned his master's degree in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his presentation will summarize DePaul's recent work on mapping displacement pressures in Chicago neighborhoods. So you can see we have a very expert and on-the-ground set of panelists today to provide us with 3 very interesting perspectives on residential stability and instability. Ashley?
All right. Hi, everyone. I realized I wrote my bio maybe 5 years ago, so I'm not so young anymore. All right. So I'm going to talk to you today about housing instability in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. And as I talk about it, the way that this research came to be is that we have a partnership with our local Mecklenburg County Community Support Services to do a series of reports each year. And this is our third year, I'd say third and a half year, of doing this report series. And the idea is to do a series of reports that look along the housing spectrum, from homelessness to housing stability, And so of those 3 or 4 reports that we do each year, a series of them focuses on housing instability specifically. So over the course of the years, we've been trying to build community knowledge about housing instability. And so the first report that we did was really focused on establishing what is housing instability. And it was really targeted to be a report that was accessible by the community so that they could understand, as conversations were happening around affordable housing, what's some of the language, what's some of the context within in our local community. The next report focused on affordable housing development strategies, and then the most recent series of reports have been 3 focused on evictions, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So when we talked about evictions, we know from, if you've read Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, we know there are 2 different types of evictions. There's formal evictions, which happen through the legal process, and then there are informal evictions, which are evictions that take place outside of the legal process and are a lot harder to measure and identify. And we don't currently have data on that, but it's something that's really important for us to begin to figure out how to capture. So today I'm going to talk to you about formal evictions. And so when a tenant is forced to be removed from the premises where they reside. So to start off the work around evictions, we pulled together something that I called the meeting of the minds. And so we pulled together people from different sectors within our community to help provide context to what was going on in the eviction landscape in our community. We had people from the table from housing assistance nonprofits who specifically deal with clients who are currently experiencing or have formerly experienced an eviction. Our legal aid was a huge partner in the work. I think if you're doing a project around evictions, I would strongly encourage that you involve your legal aid. They were really helpful in navigating some of the legal aspects of what we were trying to understand. Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office was at the table for these conversations. We had a landlord from a large private apartment organization, and we also had the head of the Greater Charlotte Apartment Association as part of the conversations. And then lastly, we had local government. And having this collective group of minds was really helpful as we started our work, but also on helping us provide the context as we went through the data to understand what was going on. So the first report that we did was really focused on creating a resource with an introduction to evictions. Part of that was making sure that we had, once again, that local context, and that's where having the community voices was important. Part of the first step was looking at what do evictions look like in Charlotte. So if you've read Matthew Desmond's book, he talks a lot about what the eviction process is in Milwaukee, but the eviction process locally is very different depending on your state rules and regulations, and even locally what that process actually looks like. And we found it really interesting that as researchers, just trying to figure out what the process was like was mind-boggling and took a ton of time and investment, and so it was really interesting for us thinking about if you're in a crisis, how complicated this process must be to understand. And so we worked with legal aid, all of those organizations, to map out what the process is from start to finish, but also identifying what are some spaces where someone might be informally evicted along the way or might be forced to move and it wouldn't be captured in the data. We also pulled data from something called RVCAP, which is through the North Carolina court system. It gives you basically it gives you case activity reports. And I'm going to give a shout out to UNC Greensboro, Stephen Sills in the back, and also John Clean with Durham, who are collectively trying to figure out how to make this data more accessible. So in our community, this was the first time that this data had ever been reported out, but it's a resource that's existed. But you have to go through like 10 links to get to it, and then if you want anything deeper, you have to go through special requests. And so there's some great efforts going on to increase accessibility to this data. But part of what we want to do, once again, map out what the system looks like, and then also provide some data and numbers. All of this culminated in an event that we did with Matthew Desmond last September. We had him come and talk about evictions, and what was great was that at the same time the report was released and we were able to talk about what evictions looked like in our community. Also through partnership with Mecklenburg County's library, we were able to have book clubs, and we got funding to have over 600 books sent out throughout the community with support from our local foundation. And all of the book clubs were provided with a study guide or a book discussion guide that included data from our reports on housing instability. So it was a great example of partnership and engaging. And so by the time the event came, we had a large number of people who were really invested and interested in the topic of evictions, and that was outside of the group of people who normally we present to, which was really great. It involved faith groups, local neighborhood associations, a whole range. The second report was looking at where evictions take place. We have a wonderful relationship with our Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office, and a large part of that is through our work with them on our integrated data system. We were able to get data from them from 2003 to 2015 at two important parts in the eviction process. So one is at the beginning when the tenant is notified that their landlord is attempting to evict them and has submitted a complaint and summary ejectment. And then the other point where we have data from the sheriff's office is when the sheriff's office has received a writ of possession to go with the landlord to remove the tenant from the premises. So in our community, this happens 10 days after the judgment to evict the tenant has occurred. So if the tenant hasn't moved or hasn't filed an appeal, then the landlord would go and request that the sheriff come help remove the tenant. And so this is an important piece for us because we think this points to tenants who probably haven't had the ability to move on their own or are trying to make something work. And so it's a really important piece in the process to capture. We also have our Quality of Life Explorer, which is our local neighborhood indicators project and Laura Simmons is our staff person who works on that. And it's a partnership between City of Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, and us as your NNIP partners. And so what it allowed us to do was to merge these together to look at the neighborhood level where evictions are taking place and some of the underlying characteristics of those neighborhoods. So we were able to map where complaints and summary ejectment happen. And I apologize, when this is in PowerPoint form, it's an image and you can see the map, and same with writs of possession. But we were able to look at the underlying housing density to see how certain neighborhoods might be having higher rates of eviction. And in Charlotte, we have something called the crescent and the wedge. And so if you notice, especially on the map on the left, you see a crescent over the top of Charlotte, and then we have the wedge of wealth going towards the southern part. And this pattern showed up in our eviction data as well. We also were able to do some analysis. One of our wonderful researchers, Katie, did this, where she did some cluster analysis to look at where neighborhoods were clustered together that have high evictions and neighborhoods that have low evictions. And then Justin Lane in the back, you can tell this was a collaborative research project. So Justin Lane in the back, he put together a model to look at some of the underlying neighborhood characteristics to see which ones might be associated with a higher or lower rate of evictions. And one thing that we found that was really interesting is that place-based subsidized housing was associated with a lower rate of evictions in neighborhoods. The last report looked at providing a 1-month snapshot of eviction case details. So one of the limitations of eviction data is that I talked about that caseload information. It provides no details of how much a tenant owes, what's the reason for the eviction, how does that progress through that process that I showed you? How many do we start with a complaint? How many get voluntarily dismissed? What are the outcomes? And so building off of work of UNC Greensboro and also work of Matthew Desmond, we decided we were going to go through actual court records. So at one point I wanted to be pre-law, and so this was really cool because we were in a room in the courthouse with all of these piles of case files and like manually going through things. And it was an army of volunteers, staffers, all going through and accessing the case files. We were scanning them with our mobile phones. We then had another army of volunteers, which was actually really great because a lot of those volunteers were volunteers that were engaged through that initial conversation around evictions when Matthew Desmond came. And so we had volunteers entering data, and you know when you have volunteers entering data, you have to then clean the data. That was a lengthy process. We went through, cleaned all the data, made sure to take out cases that didn't fit the requirements of what we were looking for, make sure things were standardized, and then we analyzed it. And that report's going to be coming out hopefully in the next 2 weeks. But the things I can tell you about is that we found out the majority of rentals were conventional apartments. We found that the average amount of rent that was owed was under $1,000. It was even lower for tenants who are identified as Section 8 or public housing tenants. And that the number one reason for tenants to be evicted overwhelmingly was failure to pay rent. But we also know that failure to pay rent can also be used as motivation for kicking a tenant out if there's been something else going on as well. And so while failure to pay rent is a key piece of it, understanding what could also be underlying that is important as well. So what? So the reports so far have been used in some really amazing ways, both at the individual level and at the systems level. And one of the great partnerships we have with the funding coming from Mecklenburg County is whereas we can't individually advocate as an organization, our job is to inform the decision makers. Mecklenburg County, every time we release the report, creates a toolkit to accompany it that has policy recommendations and activities that individuals could undertake to become engaged in this space. We also, like I said, working with that original Meeting of the Minds group, giving them this information, they've been able to leverage it to advocate on behalf of their organizations. And so at the individual level, work is being done to advocate for increased assistance for individuals experiencing an eviction so they understand their rights and responsibilities as they go through the process. Our legal aid in partnership with something we have called Crisis Assistance Ministry, which provides emergency assistance for individuals who are facing utility cutoffs or evictions, where tenants can go in and receive knowledge and information on how to advocate for themselves through this process. This group is also working at the systems level. We have a group of public and private organizations who are working at the state level, and hopefully we'll be reaching out to others in our state to advocate that if somebody has received an eviction or an eviction notice, but then is able to work with their landlord to stay in the unit, that eviction doesn't show up on their rental history. So right now in our community, if someone files a complaint against you, you say, oh, sorry, here's the rent, then that means it shows up on your rental history from that point forward, even though you were never technically evicted. Another piece is that we have organizations who are working to advocate for eviction prevention on the systems level. And then lastly, we've been working with, or we haven't, the county's been working with city and county elected officials to help them understand, based off of the maps we've created, where evictions are taking place in their jurisdictions and how they can help advocate for assistance. One of the last pieces that we're hoping to do, and it will be coming up in a few months actually, will be working with some of the actual tenants and individuals living in neighborhoods to help share this information out so that they can understand what's going on, and then connecting them with resources as well. All of this is available on our housing data dashboard, which is mecklenburghousingdata.org. It has data on our community, around housing and homelessness, and also all of the reports that have been part of the series, so I'd encourage you to check it out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashley. Noah, you're up.
Great. Okay, so I am going to dive a little bit into detail about our odyssey over the past several years to try and map out rental properties in Detroit on a parcel by parcel level, and then also talk a little bit about some of the community work that these efforts are helping to inform. So to give a little bit of context, back in 2014, we completed the Motor City Mapping Project, which, if you haven't heard of it before, it was a comprehensive effort to map out and survey every single parcel in the city of Detroit using the same set of questions for condition, occupancy, and all sorts of other things. We also used this to liberate about 30 or so administrative data sets from the city that hadn't been available beforehand. Now, this was great. This created a really wonderful parcel resource for us to use, but it also started to change the types of questions that we were getting asked. And people would often ask us questions that actually hadn't been collected through the property survey, because something like rental occupancy isn't exactly something you can determine by looking at a house. And so we tried to get answers to these questions where possible, but sometimes there were gaps. And one of the biggest gaps we were seeing was that rental property question. We didn't really have a good data set to identify where rentals were located on a property by property level, and to demonstrate why, I will show you these three buildings. All of them are large, very prominent skyscrapers in Detroit. All of them are apartment buildings, and they all happen to have one thing in common, which is that they are not actually registered on the city's rental property listing. And that is not an uncommon situation. ACS estimates that there are over 140,000 renter-occupied housing units in Detroit. As of looking yesterday, the city's rental property listing is 7,750. So there's a really big information gap there that has been very fun for us to try and figure out. But a lot of people want to know where these rental properties are, because in Detroit that's a huge problem for housing stability. The city's over half renter, and they face a lot of challenges, especially in areas that are starting to show signs of potential neighborhood change or gentrification. There's a lot of concerned that longtime residents who stuck it out through the city's long downturn are now at risk of being displaced by the economic resurgence. So there are a lot of groups working in this space with not a lot of information. So I'm going to talk through a couple of them. So the first scenario is a fairly simple question that we received from one of our partners, Capital Impact Partners, who is a CDFI working in Detroit with a specific focus around supporting inclusive recovery in Detroit's commercial corridor areas. So they wanted to better understand where multifamily properties were located in the areas around greater downtown to inform recommendations about strategies to reduce displacement. Essentially, they wanted to know what the overall inventory was. Should be fairly simple, again, given the gaps that we've seen in the data, not quite so simple. So how do we go about doing that? The answer is geocoding, a lot of geocoding. So one of the data sets that we were able to acquire through Motor City Mapping was the USPS vacancy data through Velasas. And what we discovered was that if you geocoded every single address so that it matched to the correct parcel, it would tell you how many active residential units were on that parcel and what their occupancy and vacancy was. So it was a very painstaking, manual, thankfully grant-funded process. Where we actually went through and created essentially this inventory that now updates quarterly of addresses in greater downtown. So this lets us know whether a parcel has one address on it that's residential or whether it has 500. So that helps answer that first question where I showed you those giant skyscrapers that aren't registered by the city. Now we can tell at least where those buildings are. And because of the way the city maintains its data, we can actually tell the difference between whether that's a condo or an apartment. And so these data were actually integrated by Capital Impact Partners into a broader study to essentially address displacement and relocation. They looked very they took deep dives onto a couple of very specific properties, but then also looked at the overall environment in greater downtown. And then they created, because again, so D3, like what Ashley mentioned in her situation, we don't necessarily recommend policy, we need to stay neutral. But Capital Impact Partners was able to, with their deep knowledge of lending and investment strategies, to create a whole range of policy prescriptions for organizations that are looking to promote inclusive recovery in these areas. So that's just one example. The second one is a bit more tricky. Recently, we were approached with the question of where are 1 to 4 unit rental properties and what condition are they in? This is a lot trickier for Detroit because 90% of the city is residential. The vast majority of those properties are single-family houses. Very difficult to tell whether a single-family house is owner or renter occupied. So the specific genesis for this question came from the Center for Community Progress, which is a national nonprofit but does a lot of work in Detroit around vacant properties. And they were looking to understand what the overall need was for rehabilitation for 1 to 4 unit rental properties, with a specific idea on wanting to identify like financing gaps and strategies to essentially bring all of the rental properties in the city up to actual code. So when we took on the project, I thought it would be a fairly quick, easy thing. The city does actually keep track of tax exemption data, so whether someone files as the primary residence or not. Unfortunately, only about 53,000 habitable residential buildings in Detroit do not have a homestead property exemption. So compared out of like the 240,000 properties in the residential properties in the city. So again, a big data gap that doesn't really give us anything that we could do to help it. So instead, we decided to use a multiple source approach. So we started off with this universe of what we call habitable structures. So this is coming from Motor City Mapping, a property that was essentially surveyed as not horribly blighted, just to give us the general idea of what we had to work with. Using this, we then took the Velasas data that I mentioned in the previous example, and we were able to query it down to between 1 and 4 residential addresses on the parcel. And then we looked at city ownership data to understand where the ownership and property addresses were different. So that helped us narrow it down further. We also looked at additional tax status data and assessor codes to kind of help narrow it down. And ultimately, we were able to get the estimate down to about 116,000. So still not perfect, but a lot closer to the 90,000 estimate than the 7,000 number that I showed you earlier. And then we ran some quick overall statistics to kind of just show what the data found. So 99% of those 1 to 4 unit rental properties were built before 1978. 30% of them received a blight violation since 2005. Over 20% of them are speculator owned. And then 14% have no active utility customer service agreement. But what we were able to provide Center for Community Progress with, in addition to these summary stats, was actually the property by property listing flagging what each of those characteristics were for those properties. So, and even now, they're currently helping them to inform work that's being done to get this better idea and what conditions they exist under, because in Detroit, it's still becoming a very big challenge, and the risk of gentrification in a lot of cities is starting to increase as economic development starts to spread outside of the downtown core. And I would be a little bit remiss if I didn't say that these projects were helpful for us in including and improving our own internal data sources as well. There's no problem with that. So they actually really helped to inform our work with Turning the Corner, the neighborhood change project that's been discussed regularly. So Detroit, we've actually wrapped up most of our work on the project so far, and one of the critical components that we identified in measuring neighborhood change was housing stability or instability, and the rental data set that I just mentioned actually popped as a really substantial factor in that housing instability in the city. So essentially what this allows practitioners to do, the findings are still very new, but we've already had a lot of interest from community organizations and local development organizations that are starting to have some of these conversations around neighborhood change in learning more about how these data can help them inform and especially advocate to the city, and so that way they're not just being dismissed out of hand, but they're actually backing up their opinions with data when they go to the proper people to advocate for their communities. So that is everything I have. Thank you.
Greetings. I am going to talk about some of the work that we've done at the Institute for Housing Studies, trying to understand and map out displacement pressure in Chicago neighborhoods. Our work on this topic really began with a project called the 606. The 606 is a linear park system on the northwest side of Chicago where the city repurposed some abandoned rail lines into a series of parks and bike trails, a bike trail and running trail. We were approached by some community-based organizations representing neighborhoods on the western half of this trail system as they started to see changes in the neighborhood around housing affordability pressures that were happening in conjunction with the opening of the trail. So we were fortunate enough to get some funding from a local foundation to do some research and try to understand how this project was affecting neighborhood housing market affordability. So what we did was really try to understand how property sales prices were affected by proximity to the trail after work on the trail began. So what this map shows is essentially the length of the trail from east to west. What you can see is that in the east, which is a higher income, high value, high home ownership neighborhood, the prices in that neighborhood weren't really affected by proximity to the trail. It was already high demand from high-cost buyers, so the trail did nothing to affect already ongoing appreciation in the neighborhood. It was really on the western half where you see prices were affected by buyers willing to pay a premium to purchase properties within a half mile of the trail, and that's what this buffer represents. And that premium was strongest within a fifth of a mile of the trail, where buyers were paying roughly a 22% premium for properties that similarly above what they would have similarly paid for a typical property in another part of the city. That premium dissipated out to about a half a mile. So advocates and community-based organizations along the western half of the trail used this information to try to get the city to approve an ordinance that would slow down neighborhood change happening in that western half of the trail, predominantly trying to preserve the 2 to 4 unit building stock, which represents a significant portion of the low-cost housing stock in the neighborhood. That stock has been targeted for demolition, or conversion into really expensive single-family homes or small condo buildings or just higher-cost apartments. But the reality of the challenge in that part of the neighborhood is that by the time those organizations got around to advocating for those strategies, it was already too late. The neighborhood had changed, prices had gotten too high, competition was fairly intense. So that really pointed us in the direction of trying to develop a tool that would help community-based organizations be proactive around these types of projects in the future. So we focused on building a leading indicator of displacement pressure in Chicago neighborhoods, building off of some of the things that we learned from this project and also some of the research that other folks have done in cities across the country around the issue of gentrification. We focused on building two different map layers. The first map layer was trying to identify the market, look at the market, understand the housing market. And that map layer had two different components. We used property sales activity of 1 to 4 unit buildings and normalized that by price per square foot. And that gave us two pieces of information. Looking at 2016 sales prices, we were able to understand prices at the neighborhood level and how they compare across the city. So identify high cost, moderate cost, and low cost housing markets. And then by looking at how prices changed from 2012 to 2016, we were able to understand how demand was shifting using price changes as an indicator of shifting demand for housing. We chose 2012 because that was the year essentially that most neighborhoods in Chicago reached the bottom of the market and you started to see a recovery. So we wanted to track how the market recovery was tracking across the city. So this affordability layer got us a sense of how affordable neighborhoods are and if there was potentially a threat to that affordability based on the price changes in those areas. And the second mapping layer was really looking at vulnerability. And vulnerability, again, had two different components. One was more of a demographic lens, using data from the American Community Survey, essentially trying to understand neighborhoods that had high concentrations of renters, cost-burdened households, low-income households, typical folks who might be vulnerable to displacement in a rising cost environment. And the second piece was on the housing stock, so trying to understand areas where there was a particular housing stock type that was prominent in those neighborhoods, particularly 2 to 4 unit buildings. As I mentioned earlier, those are particularly important to the affordable housing context of most neighborhoods, and they're particularly vulnerable because typically they're not associated with subsidy, they're vulnerable to rises in the markets and rapid turnover. So using those two layers, we then combined them to pick neighborhoods that we identified as vulnerable, and also neighborhoods that we identified as having rising prices. So these are rising cost, vulnerable neighborhoods, and then created a typology saying high cost, moderate cost, and low cost areas. So this is what the market layer looks like. There's two things happening in this map. The color represents the price in 2016, which is the most recent data we had at the time. Red, higher cost neighborhoods. Green, moderate cost neighborhoods. Blue, lower cost neighborhoods relative to the city average. And then the darkness of the color of the shade represents how intensely prices changed between 2012 and 2016. So the darker colors are areas that appreciated above the city average. Lighter colors are either stable, meaning they appreciated but below the city average, or in some cases had price declines over that period of time. And then this map was a clustering analysis, essentially, where we input a lot of those variables into an algorithm, and it popped out these 6 different market types. Of these 6 different market types, we identified 3 as having vulnerability characteristics, the red, the orange, and the yellow, because they have lots of renters and all those different concentrations of vulnerable populations. The variation among the 3 is really related to housing stock. The red are higher density lakefront neighborhoods where you do see a lot of low-income renters and older, larger rental housing and a lot of subsidized housing as well. The yellow and the orange are typically more 2 to 4 unit building stock. The difference between those two, the yellow areas tend to have a lot more subsidy in those census tracts and also a lot more violent crime in those census tracts. And the orange tends to be less subsidy, less violent crime, larger families, larger households. But both of those have significant concentrations of 2 to 4 unit buildings and rental buildings. So by combining the vulnerable, selecting out those 3 vulnerable market types and then looking at areas that have rising prices, this is our map of areas with different types of displacement pressure in Chicago. So the red are neighborhoods where there are high prices, rapidly rising prices, and vulnerable populations. So we would characterize those as active gentrification type communities where, because of that mix of conditions, we anticipate low-income households are facing a significant amount of affordability pressures. The green are areas where we're calling, tipping point neighborhoods, areas where there are moderate prices, so affordability is about the city average, but prices are increasing, indicating some type of investment is driving those increases in the neighborhood, and there's an underlying vulnerable population. And we're calling those tipping point neighborhoods because the whole purpose of this project was to guide affordable housing strategies around planned public investment. So these are areas where we think if you were to develop some type of new neighborhood amenity or implement some type of place-based strategy to improve quality of life, that these are the areas that would most rapidly potentially transition and therefore may have the most need for a certain type of strategy, but also some opportunity to intervene before prices get too expensive. And then the blue are really areas where there's very low costs. So these are not neighborhoods necessarily where you would be immediately concerned about displacement due to rising costs. These are areas actually where displacement might be occurring because of long-term disinvestment, and there are specific challenges around rapidly redeveloping these neighborhoods around vacant land, significantly deteriorated housing stock. So there are concerns in this neighborhood outside of just the gentrification type concerns, but there are lots of projects happening in the city, and there are amenities in these neighborhoods like public transit, proximity to the lake, other large public investment projects. So around those projects, there may be specific opportunities in these areas to take a long-term strategy around more equitable development that might include accumulating assets or accumulating land in those neighborhoods because of the value is relatively low and because there is a lot of vacancy in those neighborhoods. This just calls out the 606, right? So that circle is the neighborhood that the call back to that first map of the 606. You can see in the inset that the eastern half is essentially white, which means it doesn't fit into any of these displacement criteria because it's already been gentrified. But you do see areas that are dark red, indicating high pressure, and some areas to the west that are dark green, indicating movement, but still opportunity. We released this as a mapping tool available to the public. The goal was to just give people an opportunity to visualize each of these three different displacement layers, as well as zoom into three specific either current projects or proposed large public investment projects so that folks can understand what the market conditions are like around those projects. This is one example, the Obama Presidential Center, which is a project that is happening on the south side of Chicago along the lakefront. This maps out how these displacement typologies look in the area around the Obama Presidential Center. So we've been using this information to connect, help inform proactive strategies around the Obama Center, on other Rails to Trails projects happening in the city, and we've been working actively with those folks. We've also been working with folks who are doing traditional affordable housing preservation work, specifically around preserving market rate or unsubsidized affordable housing in neighborhoods, but also been able to connect with some non-traditional partners, for us at least, around issues like the relationship between displacement and public health or health outcomes, relationship between displacement pressure and school enrollment, and similar types of place-based initiatives. So with that, I will wrap.
Well, these were three terrific presentations that really showcase what NNIP is all about. These folks have used their existing neighborhood-based data systems to augment them with new information on neighborhood change and displacement. They've invested an awful lot of time, energy, and expertise into managing that data to highlight some of the challenges that their communities were facing, and translating that and working with local stakeholders to inform policy making, and certainly doing all of that in service to vulnerable populations. What I would like each of the panelists to briefly comment on before we turn to the audience for some questions is, what insights would you have or lessons that you could share with other NNIP sites about some of the valuable lessons you learned about going through this process, particularly not so much the technical aspects of getting the data and generating the information, but translating that data into information that local stakeholders could act on?
Yeah, so throughout the process, we worked really closely with community-based organizations who are dealing with this issue on the ground. So wanted to get their intelligence about what they're seeing on the ground to in some ways validate the mapping work that we were doing, but also to get buy-in into the approach. And these are folks that we continue to work with on this topic, and they're invested in this approach and continue to use the work. And we kind of mine the data further based on their input. They really help us understand the questions that the neighborhoods are dealing with, and helps us create a product that is most useful for their needs.
Yeah, and so, is that up? Okay, so from our perspective, I think being quite frank, actually the two partners that I mentioned for these projects were some of our more technically advanced partners that we work with. So the challenge that we had was, they were looking essentially for raw data sets from us, but the challenge we had was translating that information into other projects that had much broader audiences. So thinking of Turning the Corner and how we included the rental instability data in that project, Turning the Corner has a much broader intended dissemination than like one partner's core focus efforts. So what we really tried to do is make sure that, one, we were being honest about documenting the pitfalls of the data set because it's by no means perfect. And then also we integrated it into some interactive storytelling applications through story maps so that people who weren't as familiar with the data could actually just sift through it piece by piece, and it would help kind of walk them through and help them better understand how they could use it.
All right. I think one of the things that was really wonderful learning experience from ours was that the continued importance of collaborations in the work that we do. I think the work we did to engage both community agencies, individuals in the community, but then also there's been this wonderful partnership that's emerged across different sites in North Carolina with UNC Greensboro and with Durham, with John Clean, that we've been able to have this kind of learning community where we've been able to talk about challenges across our different sites and also thinking creatively about how to address eviction data at the state level. But I think within our community, the fact that we're able to pull together such a diverse group of data points and then also stakeholders, it really strengthened the work, and then also how the work's then been disseminated throughout the community. And the fact that we have this funding from our county who's invested in housing instability and homelessness, that we've been able to create this ongoing dialogue that each year we're lifting these issues up. In our community, we currently have this big push right now around affordable housing, and part of that was due to the shooting of Keith Lamont Scott in our community and some of the Charlotte uprising, that our city council lifted up that they have a goal around affordable housing, and it's really created this much deeper community conversation around affordable housing that hadn't existed prior to that, at least in recent years. And so having the community context, but then also the community engagement, and then also the current environment in Charlotte has been a really helpful tool in getting the information out there to help inform the decisions.
Very good. Well, thank you. We have a little bit of time for questions or comments for either the topic in general or preferably directly to the speakers regarding their presentations. And Leah is wandering with the microphone.
Hi, Luke Schuster from Boston. Thanks a lot. Great projects. I love thinking about how we might do something similar in Boston. One thing that was on my mind throughout all of them is an experience I've had in Boston with I imagine similar types of community groups and advocates that are doing work around displacement and neighborhood change in all of our cities, is I feel like there's such anxiety and fear around how quickly our cities are changing that we get just a little mired in that very understandable fear and don't end up designing a proactive policy agenda for leveraging the economic development that's going to happen whether we like it or not, and leveraging that for good, for the benefit of long-standing residents, for low-income communities, for communities of color. And I feel like what happens in Boston, at least, is we either get steamrolled because we haven't advocated for a proactive agenda, or end up opposing new development that, if we designed positive sort of policy around it, could have leveraged for good. And some of that investment in our communities ends up just happening at a much slower rate. So I guess with that background, just do you have any examples of interesting, proactive sort of policy agendas that have emerged from your work that we might learn from in Boston and in other places so that we can really be proactive and out front of these changes?
Geoff, you want to go ahead?
So I think that the 606 example, raised a lot of awareness of the scale and the speed of the impact that these types of projects can have on certain neighborhoods. And now for other proposed similar types of projects, there's a lot of awareness and a lot of concern and a lot of work being done to get ahead of it as best as possible. And the example I put up there on the Obama Presidential Center maybe is the one example that's the furthest along in the sense that the project is actually going to happen. There's a lot of other proposed projects that may or may not happen or may not happen in our lifetimes, but that one is actually going to happen probably in the next 5 years or so. And again, it's exactly like you said, there's a lot of concern at the community level, especially in a place like Woodlawn, which is a historically disinvested African-American neighborhood that has not seen a lot of positive investment. There's an alignment of things happening down there related to the University of Chicago being right there and growing and trying to attract people to live around the university. There's the lakefront, which is an attractive amenity. There's a proposed golf course system that is designed by Tiger Woods that they want to build on the South Shore. There's access to transit. So there's a lot of alignments there that are making residents concerned. And unfortunately, I don't know that so there is a group that is formed to try to create those proactive strategies. It includes the city, it includes community-based organizations, it includes stakeholders in the neighborhood, and they've been working to be data informed. I can't say that they've finally come up with the silver bullet that'll solve all the problems, but there is definitely an awareness and an understanding of the need to be proactive in those types of situations.
Yeah, and so I mentioned the turning the corner results. I don't think they've been out long enough for there to be some sort of proactive policy agenda developed around them, but what I think might be helpful is you mentioned kind of this idea of development getting steamrolled, and we did actually get that experience very strongly with turning the corner. We were conducting resident focus groups in one of the neighborhoods there that we were focusing on, and news of the focus group leaked and somehow got tied to the expansion of the International Bridge Plaza, which happens to be owned by a very, very unpopular billionaire. And so all of a sudden, I got into the office on Monday morning and had warnings from about 15 different people on Facebook that an email had gone out on the neighborhood listserv and that we should expect 150 people at our focus group with pitchforks. That was happening the next day. So fortunately, in that situation, what really saved us for the project and kind of kept it on its course to where it ended up was the presence of our community advisory group that we had engaged. And so there were residents embedded in those different organizations who could kind of pick up on this, sound the alarm, and then connect us with people that we could diffuse the situation or use to diffuse the situation. So that really helped at least keep the project on track and mitigate some of that, because you're right, I mean, it's a very emotional issue and people are feeling anxiety, and in some cases for very good reason. And so it's important to acknowledge that, but also not necessarily, we still need to complete the work that we're trying to do as well, so.
I think you lift up a really important thing, and I think it's something that is a huge growth opportunity for our community. What we have right now, I would say, is a lot of great information going out into the community, but I'd almost say it's like we're reporting, and then this group does a report, this group does a report, this group does a report. And there's opportunities for us to think through how do we connect all of that to create a proactive plan. Charlotte right now is going through a huge growth, as many of your other cities are, and so what we're facing is that our nonprofits are trying to preserve affordable housing. External investors can purchase properties at a much quicker rate. And so I know that our city and others are looking to how they can look at their internal policies to help change that and to improve it, but it moves at a much slower rate than the private sector does, frankly. But from our standpoint, from the research side, what we're really trying to do is help to create the linkages between the housing spectrum. So if we're talking about solutions around affordable housing, we also have to be looking at homelessness. We have to be creating that community conversation along the entire spectrum. And so what we've been trying to do with our work with the county is creating that continuum and that understanding, so that as we look to solutions and as we create plans, we're looking at different points along that spectrum of housing to understand what different touch points are. I think another piece that's been really interesting is we did a report on affordable housing development strategies. Not because development is the way that we're going to solve the issue. We know it's just one piece of the puzzle. But one thing that we were very strategic and intentional about was lifting up the fact that this is not just a city problem. So in our community, city of Charlotte is where affordable housing has traditionally lived. But making it clear that there are different ways that the public, private, faith communities, foundations, schools can all be engaged in this conversation and in creating and developing a plan that it's not just what's the city going to do, it's what are we going to do as a community, and here are ways that you can become involved. And so I think we're hoping to get there, but we definitely are not there yet where we do not have a proactive plan for how to address it.
So all of you walk that fine line between being the keepers of credible, rigorous, informative data, and at the same time wanting to engage a broad group of stakeholders and failing not to risk being too far out in front on a particular issue. You've all built online data systems, dashboards, mapping tools, and the like out of your projects that move beyond kind of a site-specific or a neighborhood-specific to tools that are community-wide. To what extent are groups in your communities working with these tools, and how at all are you supporting the capacity building so that more advocacy-oriented organizations can take advantage of the investments you've made in developing these systems and tools to develop that kind of advocacy platform?
So I can say a couple things. One is that we do a lot of technical assistance. So the maps that we showed here and put online are really a lens to help understand and communicate displacement pressure that's happening in the city. But underneath that, there's a lot of other data that helps people understand more specific dynamics of neighborhoods that are of interest or of concern. So we work with a number of community-based organizations on their specific neighborhood. We also work with people who are trying to engage specific topics, and I mentioned sort of the issue of the naturally occurring affordable housing stock and how to preserve that. You know, there are a couple of strategies that are trying to be moved forward in Chicago on acquisition of small 2 to 4 unit buildings before they get too expensive without subsidy to try to keep them affordable over the long term. So using this lens as a way to identify places where you can prioritize those strategies. So working closely with those groups to do that. And then the other area is really, you know, what I've been most excited by is just that this has really spurred interest from a lot of folks who don't just do housing work, who do place-based strategies. And so we've been contacted by folks who are advocating for a continuous bike trail along the Chicago River and trying to understand, you know, what is the displacement pressure and, you know, market dynamics around the Chicago River in order to make sure that that they think about that as they're trying to develop this plan, or how do you understand the relationship between school enrollment and school investment and neighborhood change, and is there a way to, because you've got, you know, the city or the CPS investing in a school in Albany Park, which is the northwest side, heavily immigrant neighborhood. They're building a school there because it was overcrowded at one point. Now people have moved, and now they're building a school in an area where there's not, you know, an overcrowding situation anymore. So it's a, you know, how do you invest more strategically across issues beyond purely housing? So I think we've been trying to build capacity and awareness around this.
Yeah, so for our reports, like we said, we've had this really great partnership with the county who is able to do advocacy, as well as organizations who are able to do advocacy. So our role is to provide the information and the data and the context to help inform what they're doing. We also try to be incredibly present and available for community conversations around these issues. And so when we did the evictions report, talking to local organizations who do work in these spaces, we went to neighborhood groups who are interested in learning more about it. I think we could do more about actively reaching out to organizations. But part of our goal is to get the information out there so that they can do more with it. And then for the mapping project, I think what will be really interesting is getting that data out to those city and county commissioners to understand what's going on in their communities. And I think there's also been conversations with some of our partners about doing targeted events in those communities that involve the tenants as well as housing providers and others to have a conversation around what's going on in their community. I think one of the things that, you know, if everyone has like their personal motto that drives them and things like that. And one of mine is that we have to understand the people behind the data, and that people have a huge voice in providing context and understanding to what's actually going on at the ground level. And so I think that's kind of the next phase of the work that our community partners are going to be taking on, and that we're going to be a resource to as they engage in that work.
Yeah, and I mean, so we fall very similarly, I think, along the lines of Ashley with like not wanting to necessarily conduct the advocacy ourselves. But one of the tools that we've also found that's been really helpful for us is that whenever we publish some sort of online product, because we can't necessarily be everywhere at once, we've now started building interactive tutorials. So that way, if someone reaches out to us through our community request line or just even at a meeting, we send them a link to this tool. They also automatically have a prepackaged set of instructions that walk them through a couple of stories on how they can actually use this to interpret or make impact. They're not always 100% relevant to them, but it gives them an idea and can get their brains thinking in the right direction. And that we've found has been actually really helpful in just making things more accessible for the general user base.
Very good, thank you. Is another question?
This was kind of inspired, Carrie Cosvallejo from Milwaukee. This was kind of inspired by Ashley, but I'd be interested in any opinions from the panel. You talked about, you kind of made an acknowledgement that informal evictions weren't included in the analysis. And I was wondering if by working with the volunteers and people who are on the ground, if you had any ideas about how to pursue that. Because it kind of sounds like you don't know the extent to which those are happening, and so it's hard to know how important they are.
Funding. So one of the great things about with Matthew Desmond's work, he actually released and made available the survey that he used to assess informal evictions in Milwaukee, and so that's a resource to us. We have something that's an annual survey that my colleague Diane Gavarkovich runs, and we did include some questions in that survey to ask about kind of housing stability. But I think for us, the biggest piece would be to have funding to do the work, because the tools exist. It would just take an army of volunteers to do it. And I do know that UNC Greensboro is doing some work around this and perhaps could speak to that. But I think it's important because we don't know what's going on. We don't know, and what's also really interesting in our community is that our number of evictions have been decreasing as our rentals have been increasing. And one of the really important contextual pieces, we don't know if informal evictions are increasing, or also not necessarily informal evictions, but what level of displacement is happening where tenants who are being rented to, their leases are being ended and they're being kicked out for that. And so it's a really important piece of the puzzle. For us, it would be having the funds to be able to do it, but then also I think having community being involved in that process would be important as well. I think as kind of an intermediate step, the conversations that our partner organizations are having with residents in these communities will help provide some really interesting insights into their personal experiences. But to do it at a city level or at a county level would definitely require a significant amount of resources to do.
Good.
Stephen, feel free to chime in.
Noah, how many senior staff members are worked on that project?
Would this be the rental one specifically? Yes. So that was the first or the second one? Sorry.
The first one.
First one. Motor City Mapping? Or there was, sorry.
Identify the difference between what we reported as in rental units versus what was actually there.
That project. That was actually me, mostly. It was a quick, yeah, so, no, that was just me doing some quick back-of-the-envelope calculations using the city's open data portal and then comparing it with the ACS estimates. The other projects, I mean, so Motor City Mapping was very large. That was probably the analytical team for that ranged between 3 and 6 people during the course of the project. And then each of the 2 examples I gave was myself and then 1 to 2 supporting analysts.
This will have to be our last question.
Yeah, so Bob from Pittsburgh here just would like to know what you've learned about your attempts to reach and influence different stakeholders and different audiences in your work. And I think, thinking a lot about the work that you did in Charlotte, but, open to anybody up there on the panel. Just what have you learned? What worked? What didn't work?
For us, what's worked with reaching different stakeholders is, I think, having different stakeholders at the table that represent different groups. And so by engaging them in the research and bringing them along in the process, it's been about a year-long process that we've been working on these eviction reports, and we've staggered them specifically to keep the conversation going. I think by engaging those diverse stakeholders in the research process, it's then led to them having investment in the research itself, and then sharing that out with their respective partners. And so it's really cool to see when the reports are released how they trickle through the community. I think also it was really cool to see, like I mentioned, when we did the Matthew Desmond event, we had this book club so it was funded by our Foundation for the Carolinas. The Mecklenburg Library was a huge resource in that too, in helping to create book club kits. And that was a really effective way, I think, for us to reach people outside of who we normally reach, and that were outside of some of the stakeholder groups that we reach. And so that was a really effective tool, I think, for engaging people. And so even since that happened, when we released the report, we've had others who are coming to us asking questions following up from their book club conversations. But I do think that having them involved at the onset of the project and then continuing that engagement throughout. We also, for our reports, we have a community panel that reviews the reports. And so that same meeting of the Minds group that I talked about has served as reviewers on every single report and providing their feedback, edits, and comments. So that also, I think, has helped engage them in the work that we've done.
Yeah, and I think so we went through a very similar process with Turning the Corner. We weren't quite so lucky in getting our advisory board together before the project started, just because of the way that everything kind of came together. But engaging that group of stakeholders, which was very carefully selected, not just to include people who are working on neighborhood change, but also broader organizations that were just working to move policy in this space in general, was really helpful for us in making sure that, one, the results were grounded, because the advisory group members would ask questions that we hadn't thought of and would suggest, data sets or community connections that we hadn't thought of. I already mentioned how they kind of saved us with that one focus group that almost went off the rails. But then it also really helped give us that platform for dissemination as well. Once the results were finished, we had this group of anywhere, and varied during the meetings, but anywhere between 30 and 50 individuals and organizations that were ready to send this thing out to talk about it, that actually knew about the research and how it could be applied. So that way it wasn't that we had to do all that work ourselves. The work had already kind of been done over the course of the project.
Yeah, I would just kind of echo what everyone else has said. We really actively engaged with a range of stakeholders throughout the development of the 606 project, through the development of the displacement mapping project. It was kind of a continuum of us trying to gather intelligence from what people are experiencing on the ground, what their information gaps are for helping advocate for better policy, and then trying to figure out a way to create a product and an analysis that helped fill those gaps, and then going back to them and working with them, and as Ashley said, sort of helps build buy-in and investment on their end in the project. And they talk to other people, and that was our research process. But then just parallel to that, there's just been an increasing awareness of the alignment of all sorts of different issues at the place levels, and I think that just awareness of that, the importance of housing and public health and all sorts of infrastructure investment, parks, that all of it's related, really kind of gets people interested in understanding how that looks. And that broader awareness, I think, has brought a lot of people to our work and has been created an interesting opportunity for us.
And if I could add one other thing, I think trust is really important. And so we talk about that, especially with our integrated data system. We have 40 community partners they have basically agreed to give us their data. And through those partnerships, we have this trust. And also, I think the fact that we don't advocate, the fact that we are nonpartisan, builds trust as well. So the fact that we were able to get people around the table from very different viewpoints and perspectives to trust that the work that we were going to do was going to reflect, to the extent possible, we were going to just say, here's what the data say, and then leave it to you to figure out and to work on kind of the advocacy points. I think that was really helpful in being able to bring people to the table from diverse backgrounds as well as perspectives. And then also working with something we have called the Housing Advisory Board of Charlotte-Mecklenburg, which is a bipartisan group of city, county elected or appointed individuals that were also able to help engage with the work.
Very good. Well, please join me in thanking the panelists for their excellent presentations and the terrific work that they are engaged in their communities. Thank you all.
We're going to break for lunch now until 1:30, and lunch is going to be in not in this room, but Atlanta Ballroom B, which is on the other side of that stairwell.